enjoy those days because they'll go fast.
Yeah,
They-
no, I
oh, yeah,
do.
they do.
I enjoy it. I love
So fast.
I love going
Yeah.
to the baseball and soccer games, and I spend a lot of time at the rink in the winter time
Oh yeah.
with the two boys.
All right, well, I will start off this PDM. I am Kathy Boscher. I'm the VP of Finance for the ASCM Grand Rapids chapter. Our speaker tonight is Blair Thomas, and he's the Vice President of Client Services at Columbian Logistics Network. I'm a materials manager at Schreiber Foods, and Columbian has been our 3PL for a couple of years now. And with Blair, we have done 3 different technology systems in 15 months, having to integrate all of that. So we have been through a lot. And he agreed to do this when we were out with some Schreiber people from our corporate office out at Butchers Union, which they treated us. And he very nicely said he had this presentation, and we thought this would be a great topic. So we thank Blair for somewhat late notice agreeing to do this after a night of being out of the town, as it were, that he's still ready to treat us to this. So welcome, Blair.
Yeah, we were joking that the idea for this may have been slightly booze infused, but that's fine. So, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and turn off. I wanted to turn it on just to say hello, but I'm gonna turn off my camera and go ahead and share my screen. So, Kathy referenced the conversation we were having at the restaurant a couple weeks ago, and I had mentioned that we as an organization at Columbian Logistics Network don't do a particularly good job of training our rank and file folks what we do in terms of how we bill customers, what we do to truly generate revenue, and whether or not we make money. And I thought that was a fairly straightforward concept that we don't talk about enough. And so I put together a couple of years ago, this was pre-pandemic, I put together an internal presentation for basically our warehouse operations and our truck drivers to say, hey, this is how we ring the cash register, and this is how we know if we've done well or not done well at the end of the month. And that went over pretty well. And I'm also a member of the Supply Chain Council of West Michigan, which is administered through the Right Place. And so I tweaked that presentation for them, and that went over pretty well too. So this is kind of a sort of a third or fourth iteration of a similar set of content that seems to be, from my perspective, very, very basic, but for some folks, very eye-opening. And so hopefully, you find a nugget or two of value as we think about outsourcing warehousing services and considerations to think about as we do that. So first and foremost, there's a very flattering picture of me. It was about 4 years and 30 pounds ago. But the key here is I'm happy to share these slides. I told Kathy, both Kathys, that I'd be happy to share these slides afterwards. So they'll be available, I guess, on your website. If anyone, there's a link there to my LinkedIn profile if anybody wants to connect and talk and things like that afterwards. So I didn't want to put a huge long bio in here. So agenda for the next 40 minutes or so. I want to talk a little bit about our economics, the economics of the 3PL firm, and then breaking it down into handling costs, space costs, and accessorial costs, the big drivers of what goes onto an invoice for a user of third-party logistics services. And then go sort of steer into a little bit about relationship considerations, outsourcing resources, what you have available to you if you're looking for a provider, and then some of the headwinds and challenges and things to look out for as you think about outsourcing those services. Fair? So what I think this is, I would say, indicative of the 3PL firm. It is not specifically Columbian's financial data. It is not anything that's particularly sensitive or private. But what I thought was interesting is if you take a look at the expense makeup of the 3PL firm. And so real quickly, as before we go into that, the 3PL firm that we are at Columbian is one that provides a menu of services. And so I like to think about it in kind of on two sides of the menu. You have walls and wheels. And on the left side with walls, we operate 7 warehouse facilities Some of them are dedicated to a single customer. Some of them are what we call public warehouse or multi-client sites, where we are serving multiple customers in the same building. The dedicated or contract buildings, we tend to have either no real estate risk because it's a customer's building, or we have dedicated real estate risk, meaning we marry up our leases on space to our client contracts. On the public warehousing side, that's where we take a little more risk. We hang out a shingle, we say there's space available, and we do our best to go out and sell it. So that's on the walls side. On the wheels side, we do what I consider 3 concentric circles of transportation. One is what I call hyperlocal, which is the shuttling and switching on plant, on premises, or on campus. So this is where if your production plant has a yard, we will manage those yards. We will manage shuttling of product from a plant to a warehouse, those sorts of things. Typically, drivers work in shifts. They're home every night. The next layer is what we call our short haul division, and those drivers are on our assets, our trucks, our drivers, our trailers. They tend to go about 500-mile radius, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, that sort of range. And if we have customers that need to go beyond that, we use our brokerage group. So we will broker freight to partner carriers who need to service the rest of the country. So that's kind of the service profile, but I want to talk specifically about the warehousing side of what we do. So if you think about our expenses, these key, and you guys can see my cursor, yes, as I do this? Yeah. So no surprise, the biggest one is the building expense. This is rent, common area maintenance, utilities, those sorts of things. So it costs money to have a building, whether you own it or you lease it. You still have a fair number of a fair amount of building expense at any given time. The next largest piece is the G&A labor expense. So it's general and administrative labor expense. So this is things like supervisors, facility managers, clerks. In our buildings, many of our buildings have a dedicated food safety person. Some of them have a dedicated inventory control person. Those types of people are covered under the G&A labor. And we do that deliberately because those people are the ones who don't go away if the business rises or falls, right? So if we have a light month, we can't cut our supervisor. So it tends to be a fixed headcount type of expense. And then the red piece is very clearly the warehouse labor. So that tends to be your variable labor, right? So this is people who drive a forklift for a living, and they are in the warehouse. They work shifts, regular straight time, overtime, and this is the labor that tends to rise and fall as activity rises and falls. So this is where we can trim labor when we're light, we can add labor when we're heavy. Obviously there's a range there because hiring and letting go of people, nobody wants to let go of people that are good, I'll tell you that right now. But that 25% red section is where we get the variable warehouse labor. The 7% in there, warehouse operating expense, that's things like equipment financing. So forklifts, racking, pallet inverters. Kathy's going to chuckle on that one. And, any sort of capital equipment that goes into the facility that is bought and financed on behalf of a client or a customer, falls into that warehouse operating expense. This is also where corporate overhead goes and things like that. And then we do have to set aside, we have set asides for interest and bad debt. We have some clients who don't pay bills very well and things like that. So when you're dealing with multiple clients in the same facility, you have to expect that you're going to end up having some deadbeats. So that just is what it is. So while the expense makeup, this is just the top 5, right? And I broke those out to add to 100. Trust me, they do. But there are some other miscellaneous pieces in there as well. On the revenue side, if you look at the way we ring the cash register, we basically have storage revenue and handling revenue, and that's about it. And so if you think about the 25% of the circle that's in red on the expense side is driving the 50% part of the circle in red on the right side. So that's a big one that we do our very best to stay as efficient and focused as we can to make sure that relatively small population is on track with driving that significant portion of our revenue. Fair? So and then the other side is the storage cost. So if you think about, sometimes I like to think about us as a pallet hotel. If you think about stopping at a hotel for a night, there are very different types of relationships you can engage in. So if you're driving from, let's say, Destin, Florida to Grand Rapids, Michigan, like I did last month, and you pull over on the side of the road in Columbus, Indiana, you say, I need a room for the night. There's a set fare. You pay for the room. You sleep there one night. You get what you get. You get the beds that are available. You get the artwork on the wall that's there. You don't get to make changes to that room. You pay your money. You leave in the morning. Happy transaction. Nobody's mad at anybody for leaving. Nobody's asked for any major changes. I asked for a service. They provided it. We move on. So we'll talk about that pallet hotel analogy a couple of different times here. So on the storage side, that's kind of that hotel piece. There's a certain amount we can charge for you to put your product in the building and let it sit there, right? And that typically is called the storage charge. And that's actually the more complex charge, typically, when it comes to what we invoice and how we invoice. So let's get into that a little bit. I'm going to start with handling costs. They tend to be relatively straightforward, and there's really two schools of thought. We have handling costs. We bill clients handling per unit, and a unit can be defined in any way you choose. So if you're a manufacturer and you make, let's say you're a paper mill, and you make rolls of paper that are going to go to a corrugated box plant, and excuse me, and those rolls of paper are consistent in size, they're consistent in physical properties, we may do a deal where we bill per roll, right? 90% of our clients, when we're billing on a per unit basis, it's typically a pallet, right? So the handling per pallet or per unit is billed at the time we receive the product, and it covers the receiving, the put away, and typically full pallet shipping of that same pallet. Our warehouse management system, our WMS, invoices those automatically. So anytime we receive a pallet, the pallet gets its own identity. That identity has, I think, 6 or 7 pieces of data. It's item, batch, quantity, condition, location, and license plate. 6. I should have to do it on my hands. And so once you introduce those to the WMS can then ring the cash register, assuming you've set rates appropriately. Typically, handling per unit does not include breakdown or restacking. And to call this specifically out, it does not typically include case picking or anything less than case picking. Those typically, so think about, and Kathy's going to nod her head on this one, think about a pallet of salt, right? In the food world, a pallet of salt is typically 50 bags of salt with 50 pounds per bag. So you might have 2,500 pounds of salt in inventory, but that handling per unit, so I would charge a receiving charge to handle that pallet coming in, to put it away, to inventory it, to ensure that it's condition. But and when you if you're in a manufacturing process that consumes only 2 bags of salt for every batch of product you run, or every production run you do, I've got to go back to that pallet 25 times before that pallet is exhausted, right? So I have a case picking surcharge that I've got to do, because it's dramatically more labor that goes into the exhaustion of that pallet through its life cycle than just picking it up once and loading it onto a truck. So that's handling costs on a per unit basis. On a per hour basis, we typically bill those. Sometimes we have, and this happens a lot of times in operations that are very variable in nature, where we may be asked to do a number of different things, and those things may not have a very defined process, or at least not yet defined process. And so sometimes we will have a handling per hour charge that we do, that we collect throughout the week, the number of hours that are put towards that piece of business. We bill it at the end of the week. It covers all direct handling activity, whether that's receiving, put away, case picking, all those sorts of things, because it's just hour for hour rather than having a per unit or per event charge. Those we typically have to invoice manually in our warehouse management system, because you don't necessarily know, the warehouse management system won't know about services that were performed outside of the system, reconfiguration things or repalletization things or anything like that. So like I said, it's often invoked for ad hoc or unknown processes. So that's the handling size. Typically 2 different ways we ring the cash register, per unit or per hour. That's pretty clean. Take a drink of water real quick. And on the storage side, I did a little color coding. So we have 2 true business models. One we call receipt and renewal storage, and one we call storage by space or square footage billing, right? And so we have on the receipt and renewal storage costs, and this was, remember, 47% of that revenue wheel that we saw. We can bill typically by the pallet or by the unit. In our world, to even just today, I know that we have some receipt renewal storage accounts where we bill by the pallet. Some are by the hundredweight, meaning per 100 pounds of product. Some are by roll. Some are by, so roll of fabric, if you think about for office furniture. And so there's a few other units that we use, but again, 90% of it is billed by the pallet. And then the yellow track we'll take is storage by space, where we bill a certain amount per square foot. So we'll talk about what that means. So on receipt storage, so there's, remember, it was receipt and renewal. And on receipt storage, I'm actually going to ignore the anniversary side because that's a bit of a niche piece that we don't need to go into. But on the split month storage side, I think is the really important one, because this is the, if you are outsourcing warehousing services, even in any real way, I'll say, you're typically going to encounter a split month storage type of arrangement. So the charge typically per pallet or unit, it covers the month in which the pallet is received. So today is what, May 12th, right? So if I receive a pallet on a split month storage program today, it's the 12th of the month, I'm going to bill a month's storage for that pallet. If it comes in next Thursday on the 19th of the month, I will bill a split month, a half month of storage for that pallet. And that logic is done by our WMS. Any proper WMS will be able to do that logic for you. So what does it mean to do receipt storage on the split month basis? So the logic is based on the inventory levels that are provided to us in the bidding process, and based on the inventory turns that are provided to us in the bidding process, we will set a rate where we know that about half the time we're going to get a full month of storage, and about half the time we're going to get a half a month of storage at the time of receipt. And typically what that does is that blends out to be a certain amount of storage revenue. So if you think about how fast your inventory turns, if I'm billing storage by the pallet and your inventory turns every 2 weeks, right? So it turns 24 times a year. The 3PL, I get to ring the cash register for storage twice in a month. If it turns 4 times a month, I get to ring the cash register 4 times in a month. And when it turns faster, the faster it turns, the less I have to charge for storage costs, right? Because you're typically there for so much less than a month, and we get to ring the cash register that many more times in a given month. Now, if your product turns 6 times a year and we expect it to be there for 2 months at a time, right? That's when the storage charges tend to grow, because just like if you rent an apartment, or just like if you rent a hotel room, rent is due on the 1st of the month, right? So when we're the ones taking the space and we're on the hook for the entire space, we have to pay the landlord on the 1st of the month. So we need to bill for storage. And that's actually where we'll go into renewal storage. So let's say you've received a pallet on today, the 12th of May, and now 18, 19 days from now, we get to the 1st of June, that pallet is still sitting there. whether you intended that pallet to sit there the following month. This is a renewal storage period. So what the split month billing is for the receipt storage. On the renewal storage, the first of every subsequent month, we have to ring the cash register and bill for storage for the pallet that is there. Now, can we or should we bill a half month for anything like that? The answer is we really can't, because we don't know when it's going to ship. We can know that your average turns are X, but we don't know what's going to happen with consumer demand, customer demand, things like that. We don't know if there's going to be a pandemic, right? So a little fun one there. We did a small deal for Founders Brewing Company, and I think they're not on here, where they needed some overflow storage of empty kegs. So they were just buying, they had a good pricing on new steel kegs from their keg provider in February of 2019. And so we brought in a whole bunch of steel kegs, and in February of 2020. And in March of 2020, the whole world stopped drinking keg beer, right? And so those kegs sat there in our facility for 2.5 years. They just finally worked through them and pulled them out of the building. So we never know what's going to happen. So we bill on a split month basis. On the first of the month, covers the future month. It's the full charge, and the WMS takes care of that. So that's the receipt and renewal piece. Storage by space is a little more, it's simpler, but there's a lot of complexity to it kind of on the next level. When we do space billing, we typically will do what we call fixed and flex space. And so when you're doing a fixed space agreement, what you're saying is, hey, 3PL, hey, Colombian, I know that I'm going to need, let's say, 40,000 square feet every month. And I want to guarantee the capacity for 40,000 square feet of storage every month. So I'm willing to commit to a fixed 40,000 square feet. We will do those deals, right? And so whether or not you use the 40,000 square feet in a given month is totally up to you. But if you're committed to 40,000 square feet in any given month, and then in that same month you grow to 50,000 square feet, we're not just going to turn your trucks away, right? We typically will build in a flex space rate. And so the flex space is typically higher than the fixed space, because we don't know where that revenue is going to come from. And what we do is we bill that at the end of the month in a way that says, okay, at your high point of the month, which is the best we did for you, or the most we did for you, where you were, your 40,000 square feet of fixed, your 10,000 square feet of flex so your 40,000 square feet of fixed space, you paid at the beginning of the month, or we invoiced at the beginning of the month because that was a commitment. And then the square footage used at the end of the month is billed in arrears. So that's where we talk about the fixed and flex. Now let's talk about gross square footage. So this is a watch out to think about as you think about doing, I only need 10,000 square feet of warehouse space, because in many cases you're thinking of your own bill, especially for companies that are outsourcing for the first time, where the use of a 3PL is not a normal part of their routine. What a lot of people get surprised at, and I want to be very clear here, is basically gross square footage versus net square footage. The actual footprint of your products in the building is what we consider net square footage. That is, you have a 40 by 48 pallet. That's 16 square feet ish, right? If we can stack that product 4 high, now you're down to 4 square feet per pallet. However, that doesn't account for all of the other obligations that we as a 3PL have. So aisle space, dock space. In our world, we have an 18-inch perimeter white stripe around every facility because we have food grade facilities. And the white stripe is essentially it's a methodology for pest control. So you can get to your mouse traps and things like that, and you can see evidence of activity and things like that. So the 18-inch perimeter. So our landlords bill us for the whole building. right? And so I can't just bill for the footprint where my customer's product is. So aisles, docks, perimeter stripes, support beams through the warehouse. Some older buildings tend to have tons of support beams. Office break rooms, bathrooms, forklift parking, forklift charging. All those things are part of the building for which we are on the hook with the landlord. So what we do is we take the footprint of the customer space and we gross up to the amount of common and unusable space in the building. So what's that gross up look like? That depends on the building, right? Depends on how wide. Floor storage where I can only go 2 pallets deep, that's a tough, we're going to end up with a whole lot more aisle space, a lot more common and unusable space. We tend to see that number fluctuate anywhere from 20 to 40% of a facility is typically considered common and unusable space. So if you think about being billed for 10,000 square feet of space or committing to 10,000 square feet of space, let's take, I'm going to make the math easy on myself. Let's say you have 8,000 square feet of footprint that you've consumed, and then you've got let's say a 25% common and unusable gross up. So that 8,000 now becomes 10,000 square feet of billable space. So always, you got to keep that in mind. Just like if you were to do this yourself as an organization, you say, oh, we need to go expand the plant and we need to add 40,000 square feet for warehouse space. You're never going to get 40,000 square feet of storage space, right? So you got to keep that in mind as you design spaces and as you consider whether or not to outsource. So I wanted to make sure that was clear. Let's see. So then accessorial revenue. This is that thin sliver of revenue that we had that it tends to be a very small piece of our overall revenue, but it tends to be a big pinch point for some clients, right? So some clients who don't pay particularly close attention to what the accessorial charges are, and some clients who, for whom this is new can get caught by these a little bit. So accessory revenue, it's billed for services or products incurred outside of what we do for our contracted rates. So think about if we are doing, let's say overflow storage for, I'll use a sample from an earlier job I had in my career. We had a pasta company that was a customer of ours. So we stored full pallets of pasta as overflow storage. They were making in the Chicagoland area. And then we were shipping full pallets back to them. Very clean, fairly easy, almost commodity business. At the holiday season, I think it was holidays, at some point in the year, maybe as the weather started to turn, they wanted to make a 3-pack of, spaghetti, fettuccine, and whatever other shape it was of pasta. So and rather than ship it somewhere, pay somebody to manually handle it and ship it back, they just paid us to do that. We did that as an accessorial bill. So that's a bill that's outside of our normal scope of services. And it's typically billed for warehouse labor, clerical labor, or warehouse expenses. So sometimes we'll do accessorial bills that are, we had to buy slip sheets for you. We had to buy a truckload of outlets. We had to buy stretch film or sort of the administration of doing the ordering and procuring. So that's the accessorial cost. That's one that if you do find yourself outsourcing warehousing services, it's really important to make sure you understand not only the cost of these accessorials, which will be spelled out in your contract, but also how they're invoked, right? So what is it that causes us to invoke those charges, and make sure that everybody's on the same page, and that we'll talk about that later. I've got another slide talking about relationship building. So on the relationship side, as we get into sort of out of the economics and into relationship building, two different sort of primary types of agreements. So one is public warehouse agreements and one is contract warehouse agreements. So public agreements tend to be more transient, more short term. Our standard public agreement is only good for 30 days. So if you say, I want to store product with you, Colombian, and I don't know how long I need your services, what we'll do is we'll do a 30-day contract. And after 30 days, if everything's working just fine, we may just stay on that 30-day contract. But we always have a 30-day out that says either we'll redo your rates if something was wrong about the business and we learn more, or if we don't have room for you anymore, we can stop taking your product. It's a very transactional approach. And then on the contract side, those typically have certain levels of commitments for resources, whether that's square footage or people. They also have commitments for time, typically measured in years. 3 and 5 years are pretty common. And then with different pricing options and structure, right? So we talked about a space rate versus a unit storage rate. We talked about hourly versus activity on the handling costs. And then we talked about accessorial costs being built up. So those are those 3 ways that we ring the cash register. And then the last button I have on here is about organizational integration. So the question becomes, especially with companies that are outsourcing for the first time, what I find is that they often will not ask themselves the true question that says, how deeply into our business are we willing to let the 3PL climb? And so let's think about if you make a product that, and I think I saw maybe Stryker was here today. So I'm going to use Stryker. We do not do work for Stryker. This is all, I'm just going to use it as, I'm going to talk about hospital beds. So Stryker makes hospital beds. They make the best darn hospital beds in the business. So if Stryker can choose to outsource the storage of hospital beds in a time where product isn't moving very fast, and they may say, hey, 3PL, me on a per bed basis for storage beds, and I'm going to ship them to you, Colombian. And then when I've sold that bed, I'm going to have you ship it back to me because it's my crew that has to wrap it in the nice stretch film that's branded with the hospital that bought it and needs to slide in the owner's manual of how to operate this bed and then some instructions for the installers and those sorts of things. We do that in our building. That's something that we have to do. So I'm going to truck it back to my plant in Kalamazoo so that I can then go serve my customers. That's 100% a thing that Stryker could do. Another thing that Stryker could do is say, okay, Colombian, how much to store the bed? And then what would the accessorial cost be to have you wrap it, put in the instructions for the installer, and whatever other things need to happen before it goes to market. And that way you never have to ship it back down to Kalamazoo to the plant, right? So, but especially for a company like Stryker, I feel like hospital beds they're a high value item. They're something that is quite literally life and death in a lot of ways. I've worked with some food and pharma businesses that consider it that way. Think about baby formula. It's been in the news, of course, lately. But baby formula, the makers of baby formula, they consider baby formula a life and death product, which it very much is. So when you have this high value product that is going to a highly sensitive customer, you may not be comfortable allowing the 3PL to do that final customer facing work. And that's okay, right? And some people don't like to do that. Now with a lot of consumer goods, it's, hey, the product's the product. Why would I bother bringing it back to my plant to do anything to it? I'm just gonna, if I've got to ship it out of the offsite warehouse, why ship it back to myself? Let's have them ship it straight to the customer. Again, that's the question of how far into your business are they going to be allowed to climb? So how and why to leverage 3PLs, right? So delayed differentiation, right? If you, maybe your hospital beds have different colored padding based on, which hospital system bought it, right? You don't have to make necessarily beds with every color padding. You store the base bed, and you store the padding, and then we can install that before it goes out the door. That's delayed differentiation, right? expertise. Sometimes it's just not in your core business. I work with a lot of companies whose their strategy, their downstream supply chain strategy is farm it out. We're not very good at this. Let's go make what we're good at making. Certainly speed to market. We have some business here in Grand Rapids that we do that is purely a speed to market play. We all know that ours got a bunch of, West Michigan, I should say, several of the world's largest office furniture manufacturers. We have a piece of business here in Granville where we store rolls of fabric on behalf of multiple different mills. And the only reason they're storing fabric in Grand Rapids, Michigan, is to basically shorten their customers' lead times, their order lead times. And so we get an order on one day, and then it's on the production line making a cubicle wall or a chair back or a chair bottom the very next day. And so they couldn't do that from where they are in their mills. So they hold an inventory here in Grand Rapids with us. So speed to market play. Certainly capacity and scale. Sometimes if your business is very small, you just don't have the capacity to go out and build a warehouse and hire people and buy forklifts, right? And that's actually similar to the financial considerations at the bottom. You may be leveraged so hard that you can't get a loan for a couple of forklifts in a building, right? So the availability of cash is king. That certainly will force some people into saying, you know what, we don't have the cash or we don't have the resources to do this ourselves. We're going to go out and find a provider to do it. And, maybe we have to work through extending out payment terms because we have to wait for our customers to pay us. So those are all different reasons somebody might use an outside warehouse provider. So selecting one, right? If you've decided now that we're going to outsource something, we're going to outsource this process or this space constraint, what are the hard factors? Pricing, term, technology, service profile, gain sharing, profits. Those types of things are things that can be written into an agreement, a contract. But what can't be done is culture, project management and startup capabilities, continuous improvement appetites, the expertise of the local field. And this is my favorite one. I always said if I ever went back for a PhD, I would love to study trust in the supply chain, because we all talk about trust and we all talk about whether we do or do not trust a provider or a supplier or a customer or anybody else, but there is no marketplace for trust and there is no currency for trust. So it's one of the hardest things to measure, but we all talk about how important it is. So I find it fascinating that it can be earned over, it takes a long time to earn, it takes a very little time to lose, but we have such a hard time measuring it. So I'm going to speed up a little bit. Some of the cultural differences, I'm going to kind of whip through this one because you're welcome to, like I said, I'll share the slides. When you're buying goods or what I'll call feedstocks or component parts or something like that, I did a little comparison, right? So with goods and imports, you're governed by a purchase order, whereas on a services schedule, when you're outsourcing supply chain services, it's a contract, right? And key factors, component parts, the properties, right? Is this flange the exact proper sizing? And is it can I get 1 million of them that are exactly this proper size? That's when you're buying goods, that works. But when you're buying services, you're not buying the piece, the properties of the piece, you're buying a process. You're buying a business process that ideally is repeatable. Frequency of use, this is, if you'll pardon my colorful language, when you're dealing with a supplier, it's as needed or on the business case. And when you're buying a service from a provider of a supply chain service, it's every damn day. You got to deal with that provider every single day. And that's something that's important. And it is like having another department in your own office. And if there are cultural issues and if there's clash there, that's a problem. And it's something that you got to work through. So I would keep going a little bit. Outsourcing resources. So if you're thinking about outsourcing some piece of your warehouse activities, whether it's the inbound materials used in a manufacturing process, or whether it's the outbound finished goods that you've manufactured, or somewhere in between, There are a couple of trade associations. We do belong to the IWLA, the International Warehouse Logistics Association. That's a great resource, and you can check their their membership roles especially if you're looking kind of in one market to say, hey, I'm a manufacturer here in Grand Rapids or Kalamazoo or whatever, and I need somebody that's nearby that has space. IWLA is a great place to go looking for that. IWLA is probably not your place if you say, I have 5 million square feet of warehouse space in 7 different markets around the country, and I need one single provider to come in and run it because I want one throat to choke if something goes wrong. That's IWLA it tends to be more independent regional providers. So just keep that in mind. Some other associations, Retail Industry Logistics Association, Food Shippers is a good one if you're ever in the food business. Excuse me. And then there's a number of different trade press magazines: Inbound Logistics, Food Logistics, Global Trade, those types of things, DC Velocity. And there's all sorts of industry vertical publications that 3PLs will advertise in or do profiles in, things like that. So keep an eye out for those. Some headwinds. If you're thinking about outsourcing something and you're looking at trying to choose and find a 3PL, make sure you're thinking about account minimums. So many of us do have sort of minimum scale that we will require. In fact, that was I mentioned the founders' kegs. It was a huge piece of business, and they kept just enough kegs here to make sure they hit their account minimum because they had a little bit of space in their warehouse and things like that. But if they were going to use some space, they might as well use enough to eat up their minimum. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. That was kind of in a pandemic that's how their strategy changed, and we move on. So again, keep a very, very close eye on those accessorial costs. Keep an eye on account prioritization. So this is the idea, especially if you're in a public warehouse building where let's say Columbian's got 20 clients in one facility. We may very well have 20 clients in one facility. And if you are the 19th largest client, it's possible there could be an issue where another client gets prioritization of resources ahead of your business. So the way to hedge against that is to do a dedicated deal, right? Where you have, whether it's space or labor, you can buy into contracted space and labor quantities, and that can help offset that prioritization piece. But again, it's a trade-off between the flexibility of public warehousing and the guaranteed capacity of contracted warehousing. And so then the fourth one was around specific skill sets and industry knowledge. Just like manufacturers tend to do well in their own verticals, 3PLs tend to have verticals. And there tend to be 3PLs that do better in automotive than others. There tends to be 3PLs that do better in food and consumer goods than others. So keep an eye on the specific skill sets and the other clients that the 3PL services. That's a perfectly reasonable question to ask is, okay, I make this widget. Do you have any other customers who make similar widgets? And it's a lot of people get uncomfortable with those types of questions because they don't want to frequently, a lot of companies don't want to be in the same space as their competitors. But if you think about what made the 3PL good at what they do, they got good on that business that they're doing. And if that's similar to what you're doing, you can logically assume that there'll be a fit, right? So we actually have a number of pieces of business where competitors are knowingly in the same space, and because they know that we know that vertical, and we do a good job there. So I would say don't be too afraid of seeing your customer's logo in the same third-party warehouse. And then there's some technology gaps too, right? There's a lot of, especially small businesses. I don't think there were a ton here, but a lot of small businesses are run on things like QuickBooks and other smaller accounting packages. Those tend to have some very limited very limited technology capabilities in terms of integrating with the provider. So that can be one that's tough to get over, and it can lead to a lot of manual processes. So key questions to ask. First of all, what's important to you? What's important to the vendor, right? Make sure that what you are asking the vendor to do, the provider to do, and what the provider charges for are aligned. I had a piece of business back again in my Chicago days with a company that makes water filtration equipment. And we had pallet receiving and shipping rates, and we had case pick rates. And then we got the business into the building, and they asked us to basically sort O-rings, like rubber O-rings that go into a filter, and sort them, 25,000 at a time. We said, we don't even have a mechanism to bill for that other than hourly accessorials. So make sure that those are in line with what you're asking and what they're charging. Do they ring the cash register accordingly? Who wins and who loses if the business grows or shrinks? That's a question to ask. And then, so I love this one. Are you being honest with yourself? Right. So when you go to market to look for a vendor and you say, I'm going to have this much inventory and it's going to turn this fast, we're using that data. We're using that data to set rates. We're using that data to assign space. We're using that data to hire and fire people, to buy equipment, all of that. And if you come to market with a grandiose plan that says, here's what we're going to do, and then that plan doesn't work out, be ready for a tough conversation, right? Because we can't just sit there and be a punching bag, or some sort of release valve especially when we have capital tied up in the process. So be ready for those conversations and make sure you're being honest with yourself and get your own homework done. What are we really coming to market with? Is it the pallet in, pallet out stuff that I was talking about earlier, or are they going to service our customers? And what does that mean to us? Of course, there's a cultural question of, do I want to work with these people? And, maybe even, do I want to have a cocktail with these people? So my last little analogy here is one from the SATs. Logistics is to a business as the hand is to a body, right? So it's a piece of the overall whole. It's an important one. And when you are outsourcing, if you're deciding to get something else instead of what you've done in your own shipping department for years, do you want this, which I love, this classic flick, or do you want this, right? So both of are a replacement for a hand, but they have very different levels of utility. I think that's the last one I had. It is. So that's the end of what I had. Hopefully some of that made sense. We got it to 7:50, not too bad. I'm happy to take questions, or everybody can get off and get to dinner. So here, I'm going to stop sharing. I know I talk fast, so I apologize for that.
I just want to say thanks for the overview. I think it was pretty informative. Covered the core basics, I think, really well.
Yeah, sure. And like I said, I will send these to, I'll send the slides to Kathy, so she can post them or make them available to everybody. There's really nothing proprietary or too private in them. So, if they can be of a resource, or if you can pass them around to somebody who wasn't able to come tonight, that's totally fine.
Hey, Blair, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Your business, I don't know if you talked about it, but what's the breakdown? You talked about, food safety and managing those type of companies, but could you explain a little bit of what your business breakdown is?
So about our customer base?
Yes.
Yeah. So we do, we are heavily invested in the food business. So if you think about food and consumer goods, especially on the warehousing side, that is a big piece of what we do, and it tends to go that way very naturally because we make the investments into food safety and food safety systems, quality systems. That tends to be a barrier to entry for some customers. So right, so it becomes what we call table stakes, right? If you are not audited by the American Institute of Baking, I can't use your warehouse. If you don't
Yeah.
have SQF, Safe Quality Food Level 2 certification, I can't use your warehouse. So
Yeah.
that tends to be table stakes. So on the warehousing side, it tends to be a lot of food. We do some work in the, like I said, the fabric business is a key piece over in Granville. We do a decent amount of business. We actually do all the tobacco distribution for Michigan, Northwest Ohio, and Northeast Indiana. So if you think about every cigarette that's sold in Michigan has gone through one of our buildings.
Well,
And so those tend to be the big pillars in our warehouse business. We have some smaller clients. We actually have a client that makes multiple language Bibles that go to prisons, right? So we have a there's a publisher here in Grand Rapids that prints Bibles in about 12 different languages that ship to prisons. So that tends to and that tends to be, that's in one of our sort of very small non-food grade spaces. But yeah, that tends to be the bulk of our business there. On the transportation side, it's a little more diverse because of the short haul and the over the road business. So the shuttle switch activity also tends to be primarily related to food manufacturing here in West Michigan, although we have some business in what I would call the heavier manufacturing sector as well on the shuttle switch activity. And then on the short haul side, we have a pretty diverse group of customers there. Tends to be food, certainly, paper, and then some other sort of manufactured goods. And when it comes to the brokerage, they're all over the board. I mean, we do a decent business in flowers, right? So we're brokering flower loads all over the country during the appropriate seasons there. So again, we do tend to focus in the food world, consumer goods world, but we have a number of manufacturing clients here in West Michigan and beyond.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was really, really informative. I'm
Cool.
currently looking at applying within the grocery business with companies like Meyer, and so this was like a perfect little 3PL slice to get.
Yeah, we have done some business, not with Meyer specifically. We deliver to Meyer frequently, right, on some of our truck programs, including the tobacco, but also some grocery stuff. But then we've done for some of the other grocers. So that obviously there's one other large grocer that's based in West Michigan. We've done some overflow storage from their DCs and things like that. So that's one that's basically more of a pressure release valve where they need space, and we're able to help them out on a short-term basis before they can, as their seasonality grows and shrinks, when they need it, they're able to say, hey, Columbian, we've got a short-term project here. Can you handle it? Yes, no, maybe. That's kind of a transactional piece, and it works. Okay. Unless anyone else has anything, yeah.
Well, thank you, Blair. Appreciate this. And thank you to all who came and joined the meeting. And we'll be up on our webpage too.
Yep. Thank you.
All right.
Take
Thanks,
care.
everyone. Appreciate your attendance. Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Hi,
you.
Blair.